Good morning. I'm Ken Gluck, the State Education Coordinator for the Tennessee Holocaust Commission. We're so glad that you're joining us, and we welcome you to the morning with Nazi hunter Dr. Efraim Zuroff. Our guest speaker this morning spent his career hunting down Nazi war criminals who performed or executed mass murders. Dr. Efraim Zuroff is the director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, an organization dedicated to Holocaust research, the global protection of human rights, and fighting anti-Semitism and hatred. He is the co-creator of the Operation Last Chance Project. He investigates Nazi war criminals and is known as the world's last Nazi hunter. He is internationally renowned for his apprehension of the World War II fascist commandant of Jasenovac concentration camp, Dinko Šakić. He is the author of the annual status report that lists most wanted Nazi war criminals, as well as numerous books. Dr. Zuroff continues to combat Holocaust distortion and anti-Semitism. With that, I want to wish a very warm welcome to all the schools present. We're so happy that you could join us. Now please join us as we welcome our very dear friend, Dr. Efraim Zuroff.
Good morning, everybody. I would say that I'm very glad to see so many students here, but I can't see any of you. But you'll get the message, I hope. In any event, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the efforts and the activities of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who are dedicated to trying to maximize justice and bring to justice as many Nazi war criminals as possible, as we can. Even at this late date, you should all be aware of the fact that those trials are continuing in Germany. And for example, just a short time ago, a guard, an SS guard who served in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where some 55,000 people were murdered, was brought to justice in Germany and convicted, and at the age of 101. So you should know that the passage of time in no way diminishes the guilt of the killers. Old age should not afford protection to people who committed such heinous crimes, and this effort continues. But before I get into my own activities, I'd like to say a few words about my mentor, Simon Wiesenthal, the person whom our organization is named for. Simon Wiesenthal was a Polish Jew living in the city of Lviv, married, didn't have any children yet, and was working as an architect. During World War II, right after the Nazi invasion of Ukraine, he was arrested by the Nazis, was in several concentration camps, and at the end of the war, he was in the camp Mauthausen in Austria and was liberated in early May 1945 by the American troops. In fact, luckily for their arrival, because had those troops arrived about a month later, it's very doubtful whether Simon Wiesenthal would have survived the Holocaust. In any event, Mr. Wiesenthal devoted his entire life to trying to bring Nazis to justice. That wasn't his original plan. He was an architect, quite a very talented architect. But after he survived, he felt that he had to do something to make the world a better place. That was his, in a sense, his sense that he had to do something to change the world for the better if he had survived. So in any event, one of the stories that he tells about why he reached that conclusion and why he decided to become a Nazi hunter is the following. When the American troops liberated Mauthausen, the inmates were free to leave the camp and come back, etc., but the army wanted to keep track of them, so they had to get permission from a certain person who was appointed by the commander of the camp to keep track of the comings and goings of the inmates. And several weeks after the liberation, Mr. Wiesenthal felt a little stronger. He was very weak and sick when the Americans liberated the camp. And he went to get a pass from the person who was in charge. And that person had been a capo in the camp. In other words, someone chosen by the Germans to help them keep control of the inmates. And in many cases, it was people who were not particularly friendly or kind to the inmates themselves. In this case, it was a Pole by the name of Rusek, who was a notorious anti-Semite. So when Mr. Wiesenthal walked in to his office to get the permission, Rusek, that was his name, said to him, "Wiesenthal, you're still alive? Oh, what a shame." And he punched him. Now, Mr. Wiesenthal was in absolute shock. What's going on here? The SS are not here anymore. They ran away. The Americans are in charge. And this anti-Semite is beating me as if the Third Reich is still in existence. So he was very upset by it, but he didn't know what he should do. And he had been befriended by an American soldier named Abby Mann, someone who later on became a very, very famous television producer in the United States. And Abby Mann told him, "Listen, you can't just let this go. You have to report this incident to the commander of the American troops in Mauthausen, Richard Sable." So Wiesenthal was considering that, and word got out that he might go to Richard Sable and tell him about this anti-Semitic incident. And some of the other Polish non-Jewish inmates, former inmates, started warning him that if he did tell Richard Sable, they would retaliate against him. But Mr. Wiesenthal actually was a very courageous person, and he went to Richard Sable, and he told him of the event, and Sable ordered an investigation. Of course, what Mr. Wiesenthal said was true, and Rusek was removed, of course, from that task. And Mr. Wiesenthal wrote years later that that was something that convinced him about the difference between the world of the Nazis, where there was absolutely no justice, certainly not for the people who were considered enemies of the Reich, enemies of the German people, people who the Nazis wanted to kill, persecute and kill, and the New World, a world of justice, a world where the justice, in a sense, would be dominant, and people who did terrible things like the Nazis would be brought to justice and not be allowed to remain in power. So during his life, he devoted his entire life to the efforts to facilitate justice, because Mr. Wiesenthal, as a private individual, could not prosecute or convict anybody. But what he could do is help the countries and the governments that should have or would have bring these Nazis to justice to do their job. So the most famous case, and the case I think that's very interesting, that Mr. Wiesenthal was involved in, was the case of a man, an Austrian named Franz Steingl. Franz Steingl was the man who built the Sobibor death camp, where 250,000 Jews were murdered, and was the commandant of Treblinka, where 875,000 Jews were murdered. That's more than 1 million people murdered by the Nazis under the leadership, in this case, of Franz Steingl. So you can imagine he was one of the biggest murderers of all time. In any event, Steingl, like many other Nazis, escaped to South America, disappeared, no one could find him. In any event, one day, Mr. Wiesenthal had a press conference about something called the euthanasia program. Now, relatively few people know that the Nazis didn't begin their murderous activities with the Jews. The first category of people that they murdered were handicapped people, mentally ill, and chronically ill people. They were Germans, like the Nazis. And in essence and theory, I mean, they were Aryans. But the Nazis, of course, couldn't countenance the idea that Aryans were not the best people, the most superior people, which was the heart of their ideology. So on September, right after the beginning of the war, Hitler signed an order to bring these people to what you could call institutions that operated ostensibly like hospitals, but they were really death centers. There were 6 of them, 5 in Germany and 1 in Austria, and any person who was mentally ill, physically ill, chronically ill, and handicapped would be brought to these institutions and murdered. And the overwhelming majority were Christians, non-Jewish Aryans. In any event, the truth is that Stangl did not begin his career as a mass murderer in Poland in the two death camps, Sobibor and Treblinka. He actually began it at a place called Hadamar. Hadamar was this institution that was built in Austria, and he was the deputy commander. But something very interesting happened in regard to these murders. Little by little, more and more people realized that these institutions were not hospitals where people get better, but centers of mass murder. And there were protests in Germany against the euthanasia program by people like Bishop Galen of Munster, church leaders and others, and the Nazis had to scale down the program considerably. So what do you do with all these people who have such wonderful experience in murdering innocent people? Well, you send them to Poland where they can work in the death camps. And this was the exact thing that had happened to Stangl. Stangl, as I told you, was the deputy director of the Hadamar killing institution. And when the program was scaled down, he was sent to build Sobibor and to be the commandant of Treblinka. In any event, after the press conference, someone came over to Mr. Wiesenthal and said to him, "I know where Franz Stangl is." "Oh, that's wonderful. So where is he?" No, I'm not going to give you the information. I want you to pay me $25,000 for that piece of information. Now, this was a problem for Mr. Wiesenthal for two reasons. Okay, one reason was he refused to pay for information. It was against his principles. And the other problem was a little more practical. He didn't have $25,000 to pay him. But on the other hand, Mr. Wiesenthal, and this is part of his greatness, I would say, realized that if Stangl will be brought to trial, it will not only be a trial about the mass murder of the Jews of Europe, it'll also be a trial about a much lesser known crime, and very serious crime, committed by the Nazis against their own people, which was the euthanasia program, called T4, which was the code name because the address of the office in Berlin where the administration of this program was situated was Tiergartenstrasse 4. In any event, Mr. Wiesenthal began to negotiate with this person, and they finally settled on the following deal. If the information which this person has about the whereabouts of Franz Stangl will be accurate and he'll be brought to justice, Mr. Wiesenthal will pay him 7,000 American US dollars, which at the time he did not have. But he was sure that if they could find Stangl and bring him to justice, he easily, or relatively easily, could have raised the money. And the information turned out to be accurate. Franz Stangl was living in Brazil. He was working in a Volkswagen plant. He was arrested. He was brought to justice. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he died in prison. So that is one of the greatest achievements of Mr. Wiesenthal. But just one other story about him is also very, very interesting. When the SS in Holland, in Amsterdam, burst into the hiding place of Anne Frank and her family, there were 8 Jews hiding there. They were arrested. They were sent first to Westerbork, which was a Dutch transit camp. From there to Auschwitz. Anne and her sister Margaret were later sent to Bergen-Belsen. The only person out of those 8 Jews who were in hiding in the hideaway in Amsterdam was Otto Frank, Anne's father. And it was he who returned to Amsterdam and found, in other words, he was given by the people who were helping them, he was given Anne's diary, and that, of course, has been probably the most well-read, probably the book about the Holocaust that's been read by more people than any other people in the world. It's already been translated into I think, 80 languages, and it's just an amazing document, which I'm sure many of you have read already, and if you haven't, you'll be reading soon. In any event, Mr. Wiesenthal was thinking about this incident, about the capture of the people after 2 years of hiding in the hideaway, and he realized that no one was ever brought to justice because of this arrest. So Mr. Wiesenthal did his research, and after quite some very serious research, he discovered that the person who arrested Anne Frank and her family and the other Jews was an Austrian named Karl Silberbauer. He had joined the SS in Vienna. Actually, he had served as an Austrian policeman, joined the SS, was sent to Amsterdam to work in the Jewish department of the Gestapo. He was the man who burst into the hiding place, arrested the 8 people, and their fate, of course, we all know. But where was Silberbauer? So it turns out that he had returned to Vienna, and guess what? He had been reinstated as a policeman in the Vienna police. So Mr. Wiesenthal publicized this fact. Silberbauer was suspended. In Austria, he was not put on trial, unfortunately, because Austria is really a paradise for Nazi war criminals. And there was never very much political will to bring them to justice, because Silberbauer claimed that he had no idea what would happen to these people. Now, of course, that's ridiculous, because this is 2 years after all the Dutch Jews have disappeared and have not returned to Amsterdam or to any other Dutch city. And I think it's very clear that Silberbauer knew exactly what would happen to them. But Austria, I have to say, has had a miserable record. As a matter of fact, for the last 45 years, they have not successfully convicted a single Nazi war criminal. But I'd like to tell you now a little bit about what we've done, and I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to help bring to justice the last living concentration camp commander, a man named Dinko Šakić. So, a little history. In 1941, in the spring of 1941, the Germans and the Italians invaded Yugoslavia and very quickly occupied the country. And they divided the country into several different pieces, and one of those pieces was a country that they created by the name of the independent state of Croatia. Now, this independent state of Croatia consisted of today's Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a little piece of Serbia. And the rule over this country, this satellite country, was a satellite of Nazi Germany, was turned over to a terror movement of the fascist Ustasha. These people, this movement was founded in the 1920s. They were intent on trying to separate Croatia from the rest of Yugoslavia. They wanted Croatia to have independence. They identified with the Nazis. They identified with their racial policies. And when they took over the country, they had a big problem from their perspective. The area that they had in the independent state of Croatia had many, many of the peoples whom they hated. They hated the Serbs, they hated the Jews, they hated the Gypsies. And from the very beginning, within months, a few months, there were already concentration camps all over the independent state of Croatia, to which they began deporting Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and their political opponents. Those people who were against the Ustasha. There were Croatians against the Ustasha. Okay, the biggest of these camps, the worst of these camps, was a camp called Jasenovac. Jasenovac was about 70 miles northeast of Zagreb, and it was a place of horror, the most unimaginable terror, executions, tortures. Just to give you a few little examples, they used to take pregnant women, rip open their bellies while they were pregnant, take out the babies, the fetuses, of course, throw them out, murder the women. They used to take people and put pressure on their skulls until their eyes popped out. They used to tie people together, back to back, dump and throw them from a high place into the Sava River, and of course they would die by drowning. And they even created a dagger which they were convinced would hurt the people who were being stabbed more than the average dagger, and they called that dagger a Serb killer. So that's just a little indication, I'm just giving you an inkling of what went on there in that horrible place. Now, after World War II, there were two networks that helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America and to the Middle East. And one of them was run by a Croatian priest by the name of Krunoslav Dragonovic. Therefore, it's not surprising that the head of state of this horrible state of terror, this independent state of Croatia, was Ante Pavelic, his name was. He was able to escape to Argentina. Now, this is a person who started 3 genocide campaigns. 3. One against Serbs, one against Jews, and another one against Gypsies. And he was able to escape to Argentina. Later on, the Yugoslav Secret Service tried to execute him. They wounded him very severely. He ultimately died of those wounds. But another one of the people who ran away was one of the commandants of Jasenovac. The camp had several commandants, and one of those who ran away and made it to Argentina was a man called Dinko Šakić, who at the young age of 24 became the commandant of Jasenovac. He was actually he was the boyfriend of the sister of a man named Max Luburic. Max Luburic was in charge of all the concentration camps in Croatia, a notorious sadist, notorious Ustasha, and he was named, he became the commander in 1944. In any event, he too escaped to Argentina and was living in peace and tranquility in a place called Santa Teresita, 250 kilometers from Buenos Aires, the capital. And we were able to find him with the help of an Argentinian journalist by the name of Jorge Camarasa. Now, before we sent Jorge Camarasa to confront Šakić, we sent him to Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, to Serbia, to meet with survivors of Jasenovac. In other words, it was very important for him to be able to get a grasp of what exactly had happened there, the terror, the tortures, the horrible, horrible things that went on. And in Jasenovac, by the way, I have to tell you that we're talking about a camp in which the experts estimate between 90 and 130,000 people were murdered in Jasenovac. Okay, so he spoke to the survivors, and then he went to knock on Dinko Šakic's door. And Dinko Šakić opens the door. Camarasa says to him, "Are you Dinko Šakić?" He says, "Yes. You were the commandant, or one of the commandants, of Jasenovac." He goes, "Yes." So let's stop there for a minute. Normally, when a Nazi is exposed or about to be brought to justice, they either say, "It's not me, it's a case of mistaken identity. I'm not the guy you're looking for." Or, "It's me, but I didn't do it." What does Dinko Šakić say? "It's me and I did it." So Camarasa says to him, "Listen, I have a few questions I want to ask you. Can I come in?" "No problem. Come right into my living room, sit down, and you can ask your questions." So Camarasa says to him, "Listen, you were the commandant of the worst camp in the Balkans." The Balkans is the area of Yugoslavia, Greece, and that that area. And Šakić says, I don't know what you're talking about. Jasenovac was a penal colony, like a jail. Every country has its jails, and every person who was in Jasenovac deserved to be in Jasenovac. So Camarasa says, "Listen, buddy, not buddy, but listen, you can't fool me. I spoke to the survivors. I spoke to Josef Ehrlich. I spoke to other people. I know what went on in Jasenovac. The death toll was amazing. So many people died there, murdered there. What are you talking about? And listen, you know that the nickname of Jasenovac was the Auschwitz of the Balkans." Šakić says, "What are you talking about? The death toll was usual. Maybe there was a little typhus. Every person who was in Jasenovac deserved to be in Jasenovac. And you know what the problem with Jasenovac was? They didn't let us finish the job. And if someone had come to me today This is in 1998. Come to me today and offered me the opportunity to go be the commandant of Jasenovac, I would definitely do it immediately with great joy. Well, we had a big quandary, a big dilemma where this person should be brought to justice. In theory, it could have been in any of 6 countries. In Argentina, where he lived, in Germany, because by the way, there were no German or Austrian Nazis in Jasenovac. It was all done by the Ustasha, by the Croatian Ustasha. But this independent state of Croatia was an ally of Nazi Germany. Or in Israel, because there were 18,000 Jews murdered in Jasenovac. But our policy has always been, we want people prosecuted in the country where the crime was committed or the country that sent them to commit the crime. And so that left Serbia, Bosnia, or Croatia, okay? And these countries are now all independent democracies. But in Serbia, almost everyone knew about Jasenovac. In other words, so many people had lost relatives, had lost friends, family friends, etc. It's in the textbooks. They know very well about Jasenovac. It's a symbol of Croatian terror, Croatian mass murder. Bosnia was a country that couldn't possibly put him on trial for a variety of reasons, so that left Croatia. But there was a problem in Croatia because the president of Croatia at the time was a man named Franjo Tuđman, who's the only Western head of state who ever denied the Holocaust. So he wrote a book, he considered himself a historian, he wrote a book called Wastelands of Historical Reality, in which he wrote that the Jews inflated the number of victims of the Holocaust from 1 million to 6 million. That's what we call Holocaust denial. And the Jews ran Jasenovac, which was absurd, totally absurd. It's a terrible, terrible accusation. The people who ran the Jasenovac were the Ustasha. And as I explained to you how they ran it, you get the idea, of course. In any event, we took a gamble, and we decided that Croatia should extradite him and put him on trial. Well, he was extradited. He actually, in the beginning, he ran away to the Croatian embassy in Buenos Aires to try and get refuge there. But they decided that they're not giving him refuge because they knew that that would be absolutely terrible. So he was extradited to Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, and he was awaiting trial. So just to give you an idea of what we were up against, that summer was the summer of the World Soccer Championship called the Mondial, okay? And Croatia was playing there, and on the night of July 4th, 1998, there was a quarterfinals match between Croatia and the best team in the world at the time, and even probably today is Germany. So it was little Croatia with about 4.5 million people against the terrific German team representing a country of 82 million people. So, of course, everyone expected Croatia to get thrashed. Okay, so in the first half, I was walking on my way to the hotel to see the match, and the match had already started, and all of a sudden, the street starts to shake. And I didn't know what to think. I said, is this an earthquake? No, someone tells me. Croatia scored a goal against the Germans. Okay, all right. Get to the hotel, see the second half. Unbelievable. 3-0 Croatia. Little Croatia defeats Germany, the great powerhouse. So as you can imagine, in Zagreb, the capital, they're going crazy, okay? So we walked out of the hotel to see all the celebrations. Within a couple of minutes after leaving the hotel, I see 7 young men, ages early 20s, marching with this huge flag, and it wasn't clear if there was an Ustasha flag or a Croatian flag, because they're actually quite similar. And they're yelling at the top of their lungs, Dinko Šakić, Dinko Šakić. Now, Dinko Šakić is in jail. He's awaiting trial for mass murder, right? He didn't score the goals for Croatia against the Germans. One of them was Davor Šuker, I remember. He scored one of the goals. But why are they yelling his name? They're yelling his name, unfortunately, because for far too many people, Dinko Šakić is a hero. He knew how to deal with Croatia's enemies, the Serbs, the Jews, the Roma, in the minds of these people, okay? And we saw this also throughout the trial. In other words, actually, I'll tell you something interesting. In one of the sessions of the trial, after that session was completed, and Dinko Šakić was being taken out of the, escorted out of the courtroom by police, of course, and the judge was in the corner speaking to someone in a very intense conversation. Some of the supporters of the Ustasha gave him the Nazi salute while he was walking out. Oh, he, of course, was very happy to see this, as you can imagine. I couldn't believe it. But unfortunately, the judge didn't see it. That was the problem. In any event, just to give you a little taste of what was related in the courtroom, and the trial was actually conducted in a very respectful manner, in a very public manner, full media reports every day on television, in radio, in the newspapers about the proceedings. So one of the most dramatic testimonies of the trial was the following. It was the testimony of a young Jewish boy who, as a teenager of about 15 years old, was deported together with other Jewish teenagers from the city of Sarajevo. He was from a Sephardic family. That means Jews from Oriental countries. Not Oriental, but Jews from Arab countries, actually. And they were sent to Jasenovac in 1942 or 43. And a couple of days after they arrived at the camp, they were taken by the guards and brought to the edge of the camp where the Sava River ran. And they were taken to a huge mound of body parts. In other words, the guards had murdered quite a few inmates, cut off their arms and legs, and created this huge mound of body parts. And they said to the boys, okay, now your job is to throw these body parts into the Sava River. So Yaakov Finzi turns around to the guard and says to him, why are you doing this to us? So the guard said to him, because you murdered Jesus. In other words, the myth, it's not true. The Jews didn't murder Jesus. It was the Romans who murdered Jesus. In any event, you want to understand how you get a Jasenovac? Hundreds of years of Christian anti-Semitism, the fascism of the Ustasha, the racism of the Nazis, that's how you get a Jasenovac. Now, the good news is that Šakić was sentenced to the maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. He was 78 at the time. He died in prison. But the day of the verdict, there was total chaos in the courtroom when the verdict was announced, because half the people were in favor of Šakić and the other half were against Šakić. So there were fistfights, people were spitting at human rights activists, and it was really, really crazy. But as I was leaving the courtroom, a tall gentleman, very well dressed, stopped me, and he said to me, you know, I have only one word for you. In Croatian, it's one word. The word is hvala, H-V-A-L-A. It means thank you. In other words, if not for you, this trial never would have happened. I thanked him, but I had no idea who he was. And I remembered that he had been at the trial many times. So I asked someone, who is this person? So the following story emerged. In 1944, when Šakić was commandant, one day there was a breach of discipline by the inmates of the camp. So right away, Šakić calls a roll call, announces a roll call. All the inmates have to appear in the central square of Jasenovac and line up. I mean, this was done every day, morning and night. And he's walking up and down the rows and totally at random, picking out people who will now be hung in retaliation for the breach of discipline. So one of the people that he chose to be hung was a doctor from Montenegro. That's today a separate country, but it was part of Yugoslavia. A non-Jew, a Christian, a doctor called Mile Bošković. And Mile Bošković says to Šakić, in other words, he knows he's going to be hung, and he says to him, listen, I'm from Montenegro, and my tradition does not allow me to be hung. Šakić, on the spot, takes out his gun, his pistol, and shoots him in the head and murders him. The person who stopped me was Mila Bushkowitz's brother. Now, I can promise you that he never dreamt in 1,000 years that Croatia will one day be independent. It was always part of Yugoslavia, right? And that independent and that democratic Croatia, that new country of Croatia, will put the ultra Ustasha, the fanatic nationalist, Dinko Šakić, on trial, convict him, give him the maximum sentence, and put him away for life. Now, this is one of the things that Mr. Wiesenthal always emphasized, the debt that our generation owes to the victims and to their families. We have to do whatever we can. We can't bring back a single victim of the Nazis to life. But what we can do is to hold accountable those people who turned them, innocent men, women, and children, into victims. So for me, that was a very moving minute and something very gratifying, something that I take with me all along, because I don't know if you are aware of this, but a job like mine can be very frustrating. First of all, because of the advanced age of the defendants, and we face the problem of people dying on us. I could tell you a story about a Hungarian gendarmerie officer by the name of Laszlo Csátáry, who sent 15,700 Jews to Auschwitz in the spring and summer of 1944, and we finally found him in Budapest many, many years later, after he had run away from Hungary, run away from Canada, was hiding in Budapest, and we tracked him down, and we actually got the Hungarian government to put him on trial after his picture in his underwear appeared on the front page of the Sun newspaper, because he came to the door one day when a photographer from the Sun, who was sent to try and find pictures of him to put in the Sun and to draw attention to his case. So he knocked on his door. He came to the door in his underwear. Next thing you know, 2 days later, he was charged by the Hungarian government. So when people ask me, how do you get a government to charge someone for Nazi crime? I say, you photograph them in their underwear. That's how you do it. In any event, that's just one story of many stories. You'll find more in the book Operation Last Chance, which I wrote about the efforts to bring Nazis to justice. It's a very complicated thing in certain respects. People ask me, what's your job? Because I can't prosecute anybody, right? So I say, I'm 1/3 detective. I find the people. I'm probably the only one looking for them. 1/3 historian. I find the evidence, witnesses, and documents. And I work as a political lobbyist to create political will in order to get a country which should be putting someone on trial to put them on trial. So to explain to you why many countries are reluctant to bring Nazis to trial, I'll tell you that the best way to explain it is to compare a 90-year-old Nazi to a serial killer. In other words, if a serial killer is on the loose in any normal country, I can promise you that the police will be out there doing everything possible to try and find that serial killer, because it's clear and it's very well known that they will not stop killing until they are put in jail. But what are the chances of a 90-year-old Nazi murdering someone, murdering again, right? Well, the chances are zero. At least until now, it's never happened. So when you look at these people, don't think of an old, frail person who's tottering. And by the way, when these people are brought to justice, they try to look as sick as possible. We call that disease Wiesenthalitis, very serious disease, okay? Because they want you to think that this trial, their trial, will be a total waste of money and is not worth anything. When they committed the crime, and the crime was not that they refused to help an old lady cross the street. When they committed the crime, they were at the prime of their energy and their strength, and they devoted all their energy to murdering innocent men, women, and children, some of whom were actually older than they are today. So the quest for justice continues, the quest for truth continues, And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We do have some questions.
Okay.
During the war, how many Nazis were killed for refusing to murder Jews?
Okay, so that's a very, very important question, because most people think that if a Nazi refused to kill Jews, they would be executed. But that's not the truth. That's not the case. There is not a single case documented of a Nazi who was executed for refusing to kill Jews. And in fact, the units that were involved in the shooting, for example, were all told, if you can't do this or you don't want to do this, you don't have to do this. We'll find another task for you.
Okay. After being caught, how many of these criminals apologized for what they had done?
Okay, that is a great question. I'm very glad it's being asked in this meeting here. In my experience, okay, I've dealt with dozens and dozens of cases of all types of Nazis. In other words, not only Germans, from all nationalities, Austrians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Hungarians, Romanians, Croatians, you name it, Belarusians. The most educated, the least educated, religious, atheists, you name it, across the board. There has not been a single case, in my experience, of a Nazi that I was very involved in bringing to justice who ever expressed any remorse or any regret. Never. In other words, these are the last people on earth who deserve any sympathy, because they had no sympathy for their victims. Among them, little children, babies, infants, whose heads were smashed in places like Lithuania and other places. They didn't want to waste a bullet on them. Yeah.
Were there any Nazi women that were prosecuted? And are there any ongoing?
Okay, as we speak, there's a trial of the secretary of the concentration camp in Zuroff, which is in Poland, near Gdansk, in which 65,000 people were murdered. About half of them were Poles. Polish Christians were murdered in Zuroff, and the others were Jews. She's on trial, and there have been quite a few trials in the immediate aftermath of World War II, especially for guards from camps like Bergen-Belsen. You had some notorious sadists, sadistic women who served as guards in the women's camp in Ravensbrück and in other places, and many of them were put on trial. Obviously far fewer than male guards, because there were far fewer women. But I'll tell you a story that I think is very instructive. As Ken told you, we have this project called Operation Last Chance. So it's basically we offer money in return for valuable information that can lead to prosecution. So when we started in Austria, so first of all, the way that we do it is we have a press conference in the capital city, in this case in Vienna, and we take out an ad, as much as our budget could allow. And we had a big dilemma in Austria where to put the ad, because the ad should be in a newspaper that's read by people who know Nazis. In other words, if you put it in like the equivalent of the New York Times, their standard, you wouldn't get a single response. So you have to put it in a really shitty paper, you'll excuse me, that is read by neo-Nazis and all sorts of right-wing supremacists, in other words, white supremacists or whatever. We took out an ad. It was the most expensive ad we ever bought. It was in the Kronenzeitung. And I tell you, it hurt me. It broke my heart to spend that money to put it in there. But lo and behold, several weeks later, we get a letter. Letter says the following: I saw your ad in the Kronenzeitung. Okay, I'm sick of the Holocaust denial. I'm sick of the neo-Nazis. I want you to know that one of the monsters of the camps is living in Vienna at 200 Schiffmüllerstrasse, 20th District, Vienna. Her name is Erna Walisch. I don't know if she was ever brought to justice, but I want you to know about her. Okay, I mean, you can't imagine how happy I was when I found out that there really was an Erna Walisch, okay? There was a woman named Erna Walisch. She was living at 200 Schiffmüllerstrasse, and she had been in Ravensbrück and she was promoted because she was an excellent guard to Majdanek, the death camp in Majdanek near Lublin. Okay, but then I got worried because there were 2 trials of Majdanek personnel in Germany. And if she had already been prosecuted, then we couldn't do anything because of double jeopardy. As you know, you can't prosecute the people for the same offense. Anyway, so we had a researcher in Germany named Dr. Stefan Klemp, fantastic guy. Sure enough, within a very short time, we got the information. The best thing imaginable. She had not been put on trial, but she had been investigated. And in her investigation, she admitted that she took people to the gas chambers. Unbelievable. I tell you, you can't imagine how happy I was. Why? Because this is in Austria, number one, where there hadn't been a successful case in decades, and it's a woman, which means, you'll pardon me, any girls in the audience and women in the audience, that it'll get 100 times more publicity than if it's another man. Okay, so I give the material into the Austrian ambassador in Tel Aviv, and I go make an appointment with the Justice Minister of Austria, Karen Gastinger. So she says to me, Dr. Zuroff, I have to tell you that under Austrian law, Erna Walisch, that's her name, Erna Walisch, cannot be prosecuted in Austria. Why not? I'll tell you, she said, because under Austrian law, what Erna Walisch did is considered passive complicity in genocide. Now, let's try and analyze this term. We all know what genocide is, an attempt to wipe out a people. Complicity means involvement. What the hell is passive complicity? What is it? She was watching television while she shot a couple of people. Listen, I couldn't believe this. I'm telling you, I was in total shock. And I said, listen, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure this case comes to trial. So I went to Poland. Why? Because Majdanek was in Poland. So in other words, the Poles could prosecute her because she committed crimes on Polish soil. So I went to the Institute of National Memory. In those days, it was committed to the truth. And these days, it's another problem with them because they're distorting the history of the Holocaust, hiding Polish crimes. But in any event, I said to them, listen, they have a staff of 1,000 people, Institute of National Memory. And they are stop. Continue? All right. And they are involved in doing the same thing, in other words, research, commemoration, but also prosecutions. Also prosecutions. Okay, and they have 1,000 people working for them, as opposed to 2.5 people I have working for me. Okay? So in any event, it took a couple of months, and they found witnesses. They found 5 witnesses against Erna Walisch, who said that Erna Walisch hit people on the way to taking them to the gas chambers. Now, one other thing I have to mention, Erna Walisch got pregnant in Majdanek. In other words, she was doing one thing during the day and another thing at night. All right? Now, that's why people remembered her. So the logic now becomes, if you are a very gentle guard and you calmly accompany someone to the gas chamber, you can't be prosecuted. But if, God forbid, you slap him or you kick him or something like that, then you can be prosecuted in Austria, right? Okay, so the case was reopened. In Austria, we were all very happy, and then on the day that I had a minor operation in Hadassah, in Jerusalem, I'm released from the hospital, supposed to go home and relax. All of a sudden, I get a call from the Austrian embassy. Dr. Zuroff, have you heard what happened to Erna Walisch? I go, no, she died. So after the case had been reopened, it was on its way to be the first conviction in Austria in decades. She died, she passed away. So you can't imagine, I think you can imagine how frustrated I was and how sad I was. but that's an occupational hazard, so to speak.
With all the division that we have in the world today, do you think something like this could happen again, is part one? And part two, what can we do now to help prevent it?
Okay, so first of all, Mr. Wiesenthal always used to say, take extremists seriously, because they usually are very frank about what their goals are. So for example, if you look at the Hamas movement, the Islamic movement in Gaza, they openly say they want to destroy Israel. They don't want to live side by side with Israel, they want to destroy Israel. And how do they try to achieve that? By sending rockets, shooting rockets at civilian centers in Israel. Thank God we have the Iron Dome to be able to intercept them, but they're very open about their intentions, which brings me to the question of Iran. Iran has openly said that it wants to destroy the state of Israel. The United States is the big Satan, Israel is the little Satan. They are on the verge of obtaining a nuclear device. The United States has to take a very strong, uncompromising, unequivocal stance against the Iranian efforts to do that. And God forbid we should have a repeat of 1938, the Munich Agreement, when the Western Allies basically appeased Hitler, thinking that they could keep him, from doing anything terrible, and the result was World War II, and we all know how many millions of innocent people died in World War II.
Have you always wanted to be a Nazi hunter?
Okay, that's a loaded question. The truth is, my real dream was to be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA. But, unfortunately or fortunately, I was not good enough to play in the NBA, and you really can't be an Orthodox Jew, at least in those days you couldn't be an Orthodox Jew and play in the NBA. Irony of the story is that just 2 weeks ago, the Detroit affiliate in the G League drafted a young man from Yeshiva University. That's my alma mater. That's where I played ball for 3 years in Yeshiva University. Ryan Terrell, who might be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the G League at least, if not in the NBA. So it took 50 years for that to happen.
And let's see, were there any concentration camps outside of Europe?
There were camps in Tunisia, I'm not sure about Morocco and Algeria, but the Jews were sent, for example, from Libya to Bergen-Belsen. And they suffered very harsh fate there. So North Africa is also a place where the Holocaust took place, but not in its most extreme form, because the number of deportations to camps in Europe was relatively small, thank God, and not from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So, but the Jews suffered there. The Jews suffered there when the Germans took over southern France, which was Vichy, and originally France had been divided into the northern half was under the control of the German army. Southern half was under the control of the Vichy government, headed by Marshal Pétain. But when the Allies invaded North Africa, so they occupied southern France, the Nazis occupied southern France, and that gave them control over the North African states of Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and Libya.
And we have a lot of good questions left. I know we're running low on time, so I want to end with one question, and that is there a specific message or lesson that you want the students to leave here knowing?
Okay, I want the students to know that in order to make the world a better place, it starts with individuals, it starts with communities. It's not going to change in capitals until there's enough people in the country that want to do the right thing. So it's basically all about civic responsibility, democracy, rule of law. These are the principles. They've, to a certain extent, you have them in America, but they're not perfect, and not perfect anywhere. And the more that people are willing to sacrifice to make sure that they will be will be, the norm, the better off the world will be. So we're in a world of quite a bit of chaos now. That's the truth. But we have to be, and also we have to be willing to fight for the right thing. That's another thing. I don't know if how Europe today would face a Hitler. I have my doubts whether they would be willing to fight against him. So that's the message.
Thank you, Dr. Zuroff. I appreciate your candor. I appreciate all your information. We thank you very much for being here. Thank you to all the teachers, the students, especially for staying off your phones and listening intently. With that, thank you all for coming, and that is the end of our broadcast. So let me just say,
if anyone wants to follow me on Twitter, it's at capital E, capital Z, UROFF. If anyone wants to know more about the Wiesenthal Center, it's wiesenthal.com, the website, and wish all of them success in their endeavors.